let's
John.
recite
Oh,
the refuge verse, and we'll do this 3 times, the first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. Okay, good. So as I said, we haven't done a meditation before the last couple classes that I've led, but I think it's good just to do a short reflection on our own experience around listening. So let's just take a minute or so to calm the mind, to focus our minds a bit. You can do that by just paying attention to the breath. Just paying attention when you inhale, whatever way that you want to work with the breath, and then when you exhale, just being present with that sensation that occurs. So I'm going to ring the bowl here to do the beginning of the meditation, and I'll just come in a minute or two and lead you in a short reflection. So now to do this initial investigation, we're going to look at when we were on the receiving end of good listening. Although today we're going to be mostly addressing how do we become better listeners for others. It's good to recall those times when we felt that we were truly listened to. So first of all, choose an experience from the past where you felt that you were genuinely listened to. Just take a moment or so to isolate that event and begin to bring it back to life in your memory, to recall various elements of it. Just give you a moment or so to identify that experience. And recall who was there, who did the listening, what you spoke about. And even try to get back in touch with how you felt as the experience unfolded, and even afterward, once that communication with that person was finished. So just spend a moment reflecting on those elements of that genuine listening that you experienced. And then finally, take a moment or two to identify what was it about that experience that identified it as a good listening experience. And why does this experience stay with you as one where you were genuinely listened to? And what attributes or qualities did the person listening to you possess? What were the ways that they contributed to that good feeling that you had being listened to, and so on? Again, just spend another minute or two exploring that, trying to identify what was so special about the way that that person listened to you. And then on the basis of this little investigation, let's generate a good motivation for being here today, recognizing that we have this opportunity to come together and talk about how we might listen to others more deeply, listen from our heart, and increase the power of connection we can have with others through listening to them deeply and with great concern. And we do this so that we can eventually help all beings, so we can listen to their suffering, listen to their concerns, their problems, their difficulties, and eventually help them to be free from all of that, developing our own minds and hearts to the greatest degree, so that we can be just like the Buddha Chenrezig, who listens to the cries of the world and responds appropriately with great compassion and great love. Okay, so again, this topic is an interesting one. I taught on it many years ago, and I found it really quite interesting. In Buddhism, we talk a lot about skillful speech. In fact, on the Theravadan tradition, they often refer to the Eightfold Path, which are kind of the Dharma wheel. Actually, has the eight spokes, and that's what they represent, are the various elements of what the Buddha laid out originally as the path to liberation, the path to freedom from suffering. And in terms of those that pertain to our morality, we have skillful speech, we have skillful action, and we have skillful livelihood among those eightfold noble path. But there's nothing about listening, and listening is half of communication, right? You know, when we're talking to others, we might be speaking, of course, but we also have to have our ears wide open. They often have that phrase, right, of you where you have one mouth and two ears, but do we listen twice as much as we speak? And we tend to speak a lot when we're communicating with others, and perhaps aren't as good a listener. And maybe some of you are already wonderful listeners, and we can learn from you hopefully today, and there will be opportunities for people to share their own experiences. But I really feel like this is an important topic. A few years back, I went out to San Francisco to visit one of my friends. And of course, San Francisco now, it still is pretty much a home to a lot of younger techie type people and what have you. And my friend, of course, was much older, but she noticed that locally they were offering courses to people in how to make eye contact, because we've gotten so distant from the more traditional ways of communicating with each other. And of course, now with Zoom and what have you, I'm really looking forward to being with all of you in person in September, so I can kind of look you in the eyes and not look into a computer screen. But you know, we've gotten even more distant with our technology. It's really hard for people to communicate with emotion and from the heart, because so much of what people do is texting and, you know, emailing, whatever, all the various forms of communication, and oftentimes just sending a little, you know, emoticon or something to express some sort of feeling. Well, you know, this is very not quite so enriching as when we have eye to eye, face to face communication. So as I said, half of the communication is how we listen, how we actually are able to be with the other person with our hearts open, to receive from them, And this is a very, important dynamic to our communication. So I've assembled some things that I want to share with you. I'll do a little screen presentation, PowerPoint presentation for today, and kind of go through a few points that I hope will be useful to you. Again, recalling that you'll get a lot of information today, I think, but you don't have to immediately apply all of this, but at least to be able to think about this topic perhaps over the next week and maybe let it influence the way that you have communications, at least within your immediate circle of friends, close ones, co-workers, what have you. These are the four topics I want to talk about today: why we need skill in listening, which may be a little bit obvious from what I've already said, but then secondly, going on to unskillful listening and its factors. We investigated in our little meditation what it was like to receive skillful listening, but we're also needing to address what does unskillful listening look like and what are the factors of that. And there's a real interesting little schema for looking at that I'll share with you. The third is to really address the main topic for today, skillful listening, and the factors that contribute to that. And then even to go further to look at what practices, especially within Buddhism, do we have that support skillful listening, though not exclusively to Buddhism, because obviously this is something that isn't just the domain of Buddhism, but how can we bring some of our Buddhist principles and practices into our listening? So the first topic, why do we need skillful listening? Well, let's look at a few things that hopefully will give some context for this topic today. First of all, that it creates and sustains connection with others. We are in a world where, as I said, things tend to be rather distant at times. It can be very difficult for us to feel genuinely connected and with others in a real close way. And there's an importance of that connection being a part of our human society. We depend upon each other greatly. The whole principle of interdependence is a reality for us. And how do we make sure that we feel connected to others and they feel connected to us? I want to share a little quote here from a book I bought many, many years ago by Ram Dass and Paul Gorman. It's called How Can I Help? And in it, this is just a short quote, it says, "The more deeply we listen, the more we attune ourselves to the roots of suffering and the means to help alleviate it. It is through listening that wisdom, skill, and opportunity find form in an act that truly helps. But more than all these, the very act of listening itself can dissolve distance between us and others as well." And maybe even when you recalled your experience in the meditation of when you were with someone who genuinely listened to you, that feeling of closeness came up again. The feeling of being really with somebody and their heart wide open, your heart wide open, and sharing that experience of being together. So we see that this is really an important aspect of why we need listening, especially on the Mahayana path. We're trying not to be blind to the world and the beings in it, but rather intimately connected with them. Do everything that we can to stay in touch with them and to make sure that they know that we're there for them. So this first reason is a good one. I think one that we can definitely understand. From the side of the person who we're listening to, though, this is also a necessity to have skillful listening. Why? Because it validates and it nurtures others. I want to share here a little quote from Rodney Smith, who he wrote a book called Lessons from the Dying. Last week we talked about death and dying, and I actually am ending up citing a few passages from books pertaining to dying, because perhaps again at the time of death, this is when we have to have our listening skills most in line to really hear where people are at, to really address what their needs might be, particularly spiritually. But he has a chapter on listening in this book, Lessons from the Dying, and he says the greatest gift we can offer is the gift of our understanding. Each of us in our hearts seeks to be understood, requires the total participation of, or seeks to be understood. For to be understood is to be loved, sorry. Understanding requires the total participation of the mind and heart of the listener. There can be no evaluation or judgment, just listening with caring attention. The speaker can then grow naturally in whatever way is most appropriate. It's kind of like we create a fertile ground for others who are speaking to us then to be able to do what they need to do, to feel validated, to feel that what they say matters, to feel that we are genuinely connected with them in that moment so that they have, again, the support that they require. So we see it's good, again, to create that connection with others, and then moreover, to validate them, to give them some reaffirmation that what they say is of value, who they are is of value, and it nurtures their own well-being. The third was brought up a little bit by that quote from Ram Dass, which is that it enables you to kind of stay in touch with the suffering others and to truly help others. But I would put forward even that one of the most important things that we do by listening to others is actually, provide some help and assistance to them. That very act of listening is helping others. But we can also, of course, stay open to others and what they might need at that time. So again, when we find that others are in difficulty, having a challenging time in their life, we may be able to help them simply by listening. But also, once we are listening to others, then we hear what their deeper needs might be, what it is that they want, how we can walk with them in their suffering and help them. In fact, Christine Longacre, you might recall her name from last week as well. She wrote the wonderful book, Facing Death, Finding Hope. And in her book, she talks about this word paraclete. I'd never heard this word paraclete outside of the Catholic Church, because it generally refers to the Holy Spirit, which is part of the Trinity and the Holy Trinity in the Catholic Church. But she says, what a person who's suffering needs most is our presence. The Greek word for one who comforts is paraclete, literally meaning one who comes to walk alongside. What we bring to support a friend is our loving presence with perspective. More than anything we do or say, what helps a person who is suffering is how we are and of how we can be with them, and that sort of openness, allowing them to express their pain, their difficulty, their suffering, and then again for us to be responsive to it. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about one of the problems that comes up with our listening to others is a tendency to always want to fix the suffering. And that can be a challenge because we do want to be responsive and do want to help others in their suffering. But at the same time, it's not always what's being sought out by the person who is talking to us. Sometimes, again, just the very act of listening to another is helping them to the greatest degree, is really giving them what they need at that time. So I think this is an important aspect to, not see again that not just validating and nurturing the other person, but actually even helping them and giving us the opportunity to know how better to help them, how better to serve them. And that can even be part of our communication with them as we listen to them. The fourth one provides personal satisfaction and well-being. I think we all know this, again, reflecting on that experience that we investigated in the opening meditation. It's very satisfying to have an experience where we are listened to, but it's equally satisfying for the listener, for the person who is with another in that space. It can be challenging. Listening is a skill. It definitely does require us to be attentive and alert, but it can provide great satisfaction and well-being to be in that space. As a teacher of the Dharma, I often meet with people, talk to people one-on-one, in person when we were in person, and then of course now by Zoom or phone, whatever works. And there's always a nice warm feeling after I've been of some assistance. I don't know that I'm of any great assistance when I talk to others, but as was just said, sometimes just listening is so important. I mean, many people spend many hours in therapy with someone who is in that role as a psychotherapist to listen to them. And we know that that can be very valuable, those of us who have engaged in that practice. So know that, again, there's great value from the side of the person who's listened to. There's great value from the side of the person who is a listener. It can be very, very rewarding and satisfying. So these are just some reasons why we could say that, it's useful. The fifth one, this is something that applies from a Buddhist perspective, generates the karma of listening. You might wonder, well, how do I have a karma of listening? Well, if we look at the fact that everything is karmically created in Buddhism, meaning that all the behaviors that we engage in have their according kind of a result that is in line with them. So if we are bad listeners, if we are constantly not listening to others and going on and doing all sorts of things on the basis of not paying attention to what others need and really being distant from them, well, we're creating a karma there. We're creating a karma to have good listening blocked for us because we're not listening to others. So if you have that in your life, I'm just saying it's possible. If you feel like nobody ever listens to you, you talk and you say things and people forget what you said or they don't even pay attention in the first place, well, then maybe we need to be better listeners ourselves. Be quite attentive to that. There is a karma to listening as well. As I said, we often talk about the karma of speaking and how our speaking has an effect on others. And it does have to some degree how they listen to us. When we are truthful and honest in everything we say, well, then others have a tendency to believe us and to not to doubt our word. But at the same time, here we're talking about a genuine listening skill that we need to have that is karmically conditioned. If we have not listened well in the past, it's possible that we won't be listened to well in the present and in the future. So I threw that in there because I think it is an important aspect to pay attention to in Buddhist terms. The last one of these builds our practice of mindfulness and focus. As all of you know, mindfulness and kind of developing an attentive mind is an element of Buddhism, and it is, of course, an element of many of the contemplative traditions in the world. But this is obviously something that we need to have in order to change our minds, is the ability to stay present with what's going on and to be critically examining what's going on. Mindfulness isn't just sort of an unconditional presence with whatever's happening. It means that we also are investigating, looking at things, trying to be sure that we're in line with the teachings that we're trying to follow. So this is an important aspect as well, is our listening in this way by having skillful, mindful listening to others. This creates an opportunity for us to continue that practice. Most of us, of course, engage in some element of that practice on our cushion every day by having some mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of the topics we're meditating on, and so on. We have to have that mindfulness when we get off the cushion. Sometimes I compare this to the idea of like if you had a bunch of wild horses and you corralled them all, and then you sort of, left and you left the gate open so that they would all leave the corral, right? That's kind of what happens if we sit down to meditate and we kind of corral the horses. We calm the mind, make the mind very focused, but then we don't maintain that mindfulness through our day. Well, then every day when we sit down to meditate, we've got to get the horses corralled again to start with. So try to let your mindfulness carry over, of course, into your daily practice. And your practice of listening is a way that you can actually augment that mindfulness. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. There's a wonderful article in one of the main books that I use for this as a resource for this, a book called The Wisdom of Listening. And I'll share a little bit about one of the authors in there, what she said about how we can even compare it to our meditation practice when we're listening to another. So these are some reasons. I'm sure you might have other reasons on your own why you think it's good to have skillful listening. But we do see that in the world that we live in currently, it's really an important skill that I think gets overlooked a lot. Let's go on to the second one, unskillful listening and its factors. It's sometimes nice to look at the sort of the downside, when we've been on the receiving end or the giving end of unskillful listening. We didn't do that as an investigation for the meditation. We looked at the other side of it. But to this question, what have your own experiences been like when on the receiving end of unskillful listening? Maybe I'll open it up here. If we don't have to go into a huge share, but giving up people an opportunity to share something about an experience. Might even take a moment to recall an experience where you felt that you weren't listened to, where the listening was lacking on the part of the other person. And what was that like to be on the receiving end of that? And sort of what are the elements of that that you can recall? Does anyone want to share anything today? Feel free to just unmute and share if you do have something. I'm sure we've all felt not listened to. Yes? Has there been a time recently when that was the case? Okay, not going to get any sharing today. So everyone wants to listen. So, yes, Lou, did you have something or no? Okay. So, so again, let's take a look at what I've assembled here, which again, from my experience of not being listened to, I mean, it often had to do with kind of the situation being a little bit difficult, people being very busy and sort of, I feel like there's no sort of space for me to be able to connect with the other person. Um, it feels very challenging to be on the receiving end of that because I never know if what I have said has been received. Has the other person actually taken it in and even begun to process it? So let's give a little bit more flavor to this by sharing this. I mentioned this earlier. This is a wonderful little tool to help us to look at what what listening looks like when it is not so good and when it looks like when it's quite good. And this is from a book called The Wisdom of Listening. We're going to look first at what is listening like when it's not so beneficial, not so helpful. And this is what's called Stern scale of psychological attunement. I haven't really found too much on the internet about this, but again, it's in this book, The Wisdom of Listening, which actually it's edited by Mark Brady, and it's a series of articles from different people. This couple, Charles and Ann Simpkinson, have developed this or work with this Stern scale of psychological attunement, and it's cited in an article that they had there called Feeding One Another. It's based on the concept of psychological nutrition that is received through attunement. So let's talk about these words, because like attunement, how often do we use this word? Attunement describes how reactive a person is to another's emotional needs and moods. A person who is well attuned will respond with appropriate language and behaviors based on another person's emotional state. Right? They're attuned to what's going on with that person. And as it says here, they are good at recognizing moods and emotions in another person and adapting their own response in accordance. Sounds like something we want to do, right? So it's important to investigate, well, what does this scale of attunement look like, and how do we actually find a way of being in the world so that we do feel more attuned with others, and hopefully others begin to feel more attuned with us. Again, perhaps we have that karma of listening that helps create even others to listen to us when we are better listeners. So this is from The Wisdom of Listening, again, from that article by the Simpkinsons. It says, for the sake of discussion, let's say that the nutritional richness of attunement can be measured in units, minimum daily psychological nutrition requirements, MDPNRs. Though the precise number of those units has not yet been researched or established, we recommend at least one daily exchange containing 6 units of nutritional attention. Of course, we're going to go through this and see how do we get our units of nutritional attention. And I would say, again, the way that they worded this is a little weird. As we go through it, we'll see that at least one communication where you have a full 6 units of nutritional attention, because everything below 6 is actually quite unsatisfying. So again, this is like how we get our nutrition in terms of attention, attunement with others. So the following scale provides you with a way of estimating the value of the attention you are receiving and giving. And remember, a person needs to be empathically mirrored in order to maintain a strong and healthy sense of worth. Here are some guidelines for measuring the nutritional value of the responses you give or you get from others. So let's take a look at these. Again, there's a lot in that sentence, set of sentences there. Empathically mirrored means, again, that we're going to feel that others are in connection with us. As I said, that's one of the chief benefits of having good listening skills, being skillful in our listening. And that's not the only way that we get a strong and healthy sense of worth, because we know that comes from a lot of different factors, but it's one of the main ways that we do. So again, here's the guidelines for how we how we can measure the responses that we give to others or what we get from others. Here we lose a point, kind of take away a point, because this is what is called beyond unresponsive. So the next one is going to be unresponsive, but this is kind of like beyond unresponsive. So I'm going to read the little passage. It's very short from each of these. That's from this wonderful book, The Wisdom of Listening, that I mentioned earlier. So beyond responsive is described in this way: the person you are talking with interrupts you in the middle of your sentence and shifts to a different topic. Subtract 1 unit. Okay. Have we been on the receiving end of experiencing that, right? Where you just start talking to somebody and they go, oh, by the way, da 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 da, whatever. They're like not even really paying attention. You just, they're not even being responsive in any way. They're beyond that. Okay, so that's a negative. We don't even get a unit out of that. 0, I'll go back to the slides in a moment. 0 is unresponsive. So that was beyond unresponsive and it was a negative. Unresponsive is the person obviously isn't listening, only waiting for you to stop talking. When you finish, the person shifts to an entirely different topic. So here, at least they're letting you talk. But as soon as you're done, they're like, okay, well then let's go on to something else, right? So before they interrupted you, before you even finished and took you on another, little journey somewhere else, but at least, here you get the chance to talk. So it's a zero. You don't get any real nutrition out of it, but nonetheless, you at least had an opportunity to say your piece. Getting 1 point of these sort of units, getting 1 unit of nutrition from this psychological interchange is called indirectly unresponsive. For this one, it's described as the other person says or implies, well, you shouldn't feel that way. They're not wanting to get into it. They're not wanting to validate your feelings. They're simply saying, oh, that's crazy for you to feel that way. Okay, it's not unresponsive in general, but it's still indirectly unresponsive because it's not really responding to what you have communicated. It's invalidating it. 2 points you get for self-referential free association. So I think we can guess what this is. By self-referential, I mean that the person's going to start talking about themselves, right? So the person says something like, oh yeah, that reminds me of the time when or, oh, well, you think you had it bad. Listen to what happened to me, and makes no other reference to anything you have said. So again, they've heard what you said to some degree, because there is a difference between hearing and listening. I didn't mention that earlier, but I think we all are getting that. They heard what you said because the topic clicked with them at some point. But it became self-referential. They started talking about themselves. This happened to my partner. He had lost his father a few years back, and he ran into one of the neighbors or whatever. And the neighbor asked, well, how are you doing? And he says, oh, I just lost my father. And the other person said, oh, I lost my father too, a couple of years back, blah, 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 blah. And I mean, and it can be a way of connecting with others. I'm not saying that common suffering might be a way of connecting with others, but the way this person said it was simply self-referential and didn't want to really go into any investigation of my partner's pain and what was going on for him and so on. So the next one is just simply free association. It's worth 3 points. Okay. It's a little more nourishing, but it's still not up to a full meal. The person responds to your statement by going off on a tangent and making only an indirect reference to what you have said. So again, they've done a free association into something else, and they might occasionally refer back, but it's really not engaging because again, it's more about what they want to talk about, what they would like to be engaged in. Let's go back to the screen and I'll introduce you to the 4 points, the 4 nutritional units. The fourth is impersonal yet non-nurturing, impersonal and non-nurturing. The person indicates that they have heard you, but offers no sympathetic or empathic response. Basically, their stance is, that's the way the cookie crumbles. So again, it's not telling you shouldn't feel that way. So it's not being kind of that direct, and kind of saying something to validate your feelings, but it's not very nurturing. Why? Because although they've listened to you, although they haven't taken you in a whole other direction through free association or self-reference, they still are not really connecting with you because they think it's just, it's just the way it goes. I'm sorry that happened to you. And they don't want to engage in it any further. You get 5 points from what's called a superficial response. And of course, we have to keep in mind as we're going this, we're talking about being on the receiving end, but we have to look back at our own experiences of listening and were we doing that to others. Superficial is, although the person responds by saying, yeah, I know what you mean, they don't sound sincere or empathic. So their empathy is very limited, right? Because they simply are keeping it very superficial, not wanting to go into an investigation of what's really happening for you, what you're feeling, and so on. So again, they say they know what you mean. They did listen, or at least again hear, but their listening was very deficient. So I think these give us a good idea, these 7 that are on here, again, from a -1 all the way up to 5 points, about how we can have varied experiences of being with others where the listening is not so skillful on our part, and we do these things to others, or it's unskillful on the part of the other person, and we have to be on the receiving end of these sorts of responses or lack of responses as they may be. Okay, why do we do these things? What are the factors that contribute to unskillful listening? We've already talked a little bit about distraction, being bored, kind of being not engaged. As I said, in our culture with all of the high tech stuff and everything, distraction is a key element of it. In fact, I might mention, we're going to talk a little bit more about mindfulness and that later, but Alan Wallace in his book, The Attention Revolution, that is all about meditative practices to focus the mind. He says we all have ADD to some degree, right? We use this clinical diagnosis of attention deficit disorder for people who exhibit particular things, or even ADHD, right? You have various levels that you might say meet some sort of diagnostic criteria, but at the same time, we all have attention deficit disorder in this world. And I think it only gets worse as technology continues to develop and we find more and more distance between people. One of the unfortunate things about the pandemic, it's been fortunate in that it's allowed so many of these sorts of things to be able to be accessed so we can be with each other in a different space, but it has definitely cut people off from other people to a large degree. And many people have suffered from that. But if we continue in society to not look at that as being a key element of kind of being able to be with others and connect with others, I think a lot of the technology could continue to be an obstacle for us, continue to create more distraction and less connection. So let's look at a couple of other factors that I've identified that contribute to this judgment. This is going on in the mind of many of the people on that list when we were going through the various units for people who weren't skillful listening, is that they were perhaps judging what we were saying, or in some way not wanting to completely validate what we were saying. We do this quite naturally in our society. We judge other people. We put labels on other people. We are assessing people constantly, sometimes coming out of our own insecurity with ourselves, not being comfortable with who we are. We want to always be finding fault with others even. So this is something to kind of keep in mind, is that we have to stop the judgment mind if we're going to actually be genuinely with the other person. As I mentioned earlier, one of the problems with, we say that good listening helps us to help the other person, but we do have sometimes a tendency to fix the other person's problem. And that one actually wasn't mentioned in the list, right? But that is another way that sometimes people respond. They might hear what we say, but they go, oh, did you try talking to your therapist about that, or something? Well, that's not very empathetic, right? And that's not very, it's just simply pawning it off to something else and saying, well, I think you can fix it this way, or I think you can manage it that way. Again, sometimes people might appreciate some suggestions, but a good listener won't just simply offer ways to fix the problem. They actually want to investigate what the person's actually doing, how they are, working with things, what they're open to before they start throwing things at the other person. And again, sometimes they don't even need that. That's not what people are looking for sometimes when they come to us. They're just wanting to be heard and listened to in a really genuine way. So again, I think we have to be careful when that tendency to fix things comes into the picture. Of course, this is part of what we saw when we looked at those, in those deficient units, was that some people get quite reactive to what's being said, or they take things personally. They only see it in terms of self-reference and looking at how this relates to me, because they don't have the ability to actually be with the other person in any sort of genuine way, because they can't help but see things through their own lens. I might share a quote here in terms of this kind of reactivity, taking things personally. Where did I put that quote? Let me see. I don't know if I have that quote on my list here. Maybe I'll come back around to it if I find it. But the thing is that when we do take things personally, that it blocks us from really being with the other person and feeling what they're feeling. Self-absorption and self-centeredness. Of course, we talk about self-centeredness a lot in Buddhism. In our Thursday night class, we've been going through all of the Lojong training, that the mind training that helps us to overcome so much of our self-centeredness and preoccupation with ourselves. But many people still aren't addressing that, and we ourselves have lots of room to, work on addressing that mind and how it gets in the way. But once people sort of focus on themselves and become totally about themselves and their needs, well, then it's very difficult to be genuinely with another, to really put the other person's needs first. So these are all factors I think that contribute, and no doubt, again, there are many others out there that I'm not able to uh, see and share with you. But unskillful listening, we've all been on the receiving end, and no doubt we've all been on the giving end. So it is important that we identify some of the things that influence that so that we can do the opposite in regard to skillful listening and its factors. Before we get into skillful listening and its factors, I might mention that Mark Brady, the editor of that book, The Wisdom of Listening, in his introduction, he says, listening is a practice, and a practice that takes practice. And being skillful does not require being perfect. So as we start looking at skillful listening, it is important that we understand that all the sort of factors that we look at that contribute to it, all the fourth topic, the practices that support it, all of this these are things we can engage in, and we have to engage in if we're going to become better listeners. So let's take a look at the rest of the Stern scale of psychological attunement and really investigate what does it look like to be actually getting a healthy meal of these units that were discussed here. So let's go to that. This is on the next page of that book, page 44. What is adequate? Okay, adequate. I think we can all gain some, idea what that is. The person shows evidence that they heard what you said, but they don't show interest or follow up your statement by encouraging you to expand upon it. So they might look genuinely concerned, right? They go, "Oh, I'm so sorry that that's going, on for you," but they're not wanting to take it further. Again, I think that some of the things we talked about, people being distracted or even being too busy with their lives, sometimes that gets in the way, right? Because somebody might really feel the need to talk to you, but you've always got, 10 zillion things to do, and, things that you feel are more important at the time. But sometimes for the person who really needs to be listened to, that is the most important thing, is to set all of that aside and to be able to be with them and go further. And we're going to see that with the next one, the number, you get 7 points when it's actually what is called responsive. So you're finally in the responsive kind of category where you're simply not just hearing the words, listening to some degree, but here you're actually responding. The person not only hears what you said, but also inquires further so that you can elaborate. They ask questions that demonstrate interest. This is one of the key things that we see involved in this, is showing some encouragement and interest. And if you recall once more back to that experience that we talked about, or that I had you meditate on in the meditation before we started, no doubt that was a part of it, right? The person was really engaged in what you were saying and wanted you to say more, wanted to investigate more with you, was very interested in what you had to say. We know that it's very different receiving that, right? That's a healthy meal now. We're into the 7 points, so 7 units that we're getting from that interchange. The last one, number 8, is what's called resonant. The person indicates that they emotionally resonate with what you have said by responding with statements that show they are trying to imagine what you are experiencing. Again, one of the things not to say to somebody is to say, "I know exactly what you're going through," kind of like the way that guy did to my partner, like, "Oh, my father died, and yeah, I went through that all as well." It's good to say, I can imagine it's a really hard time for you, but we don't know what somebody is going through emotionally. But this is important, to kind of have this mind that is willing to be there with the other person with your heart sort of wide open, to go from these, horribly unresponsive ways of being with others to actually be resonant with them, to be in tune with them and have that attunement that we spoke of earlier, where you actually can be with the other person and know what they're feeling to some degree. Again, as I said, you won't know completely, but you are at least with them in that way. We're going to see that empathy is a key part of this. Kind of empathy is obviously involved in this type of connection that we want to create with others. So these are some factors that contribute to skillful listening. The first one is kind of I got this actually from a book that's called The Art of Listening in a Healing Way by James E. Miller. It's not a Buddhist book by any means. The one by Mark Brady does bring in a lot of Buddhist writers. But we have so much stuff that when we are sitting down to listen to somebody, we often haven't created a sort of space to listen. And that may be physically too. Of course, we have to make sure that the environment that we are in is one that is conducive to listening to another. But mostly it's the internal environment. To what degree do we have our own stuff floating around in our heads that haven't allowed the space for us to be able to be on the receiving end of whatever that person is going to say? This is where hopefully we have time to prepare ourselves for that. And this can actually point to a practice of spending some time quietly stilling the mind, being able to be in a space so that we then can be receptive to whatever it is that others are going to say to us. But if we haven't created a sort of internal space, then the other person is going to feel like there's some blockage there. So we have to look at, what's going on for ourselves at that time. If we're sitting down and getting ready to listen to somebody, what sorts of thoughts and preconceptions and preoccupations do we have that are happening? And to what degree can we set them aside? Can we move them away so that we can actually welcome in the other person? It's kind of like having clutter in your house. If you were going to have guests come over, but you had all these boxes and things all in the passageways where people would be walking, well, it's not very welcoming. You need to have to kind of clear it all away. We have to clear away our own internal, baggage and storage and whatever. So the second one, maintaining presence and attention. Of course, this once more points back to some of the skills that we develop in Buddhism, but I think it goes a little beyond this. I do want to share a little bit from that book I just mentioned by James E. Miller, and kind of three things that he says contribute to kind of how we can be in that space. He starts off by saying, your listening does not happen magically. Whoops, somehow it clicked again. Your listening does not happen magically. It occurs only with focus. The first focus that is asked of you is a decision that is, in reality, three separate decisions. So there's kind of three components to make sure that when we are preparing to be with that person and listen to them, we've not only cleared the space, but we are ready to be focused. We are ready to be with them in that way. First, the most basic question is, will I do more than merely hear? As we saw in that kind of going through those various psychological attunement, the deficient units, most of those are people who are just simply hearing. And their hearing is oftentimes even quite deficient, where they're not necessarily even hearing what we're saying because they're already thinking about what they want to say or what topic they'd prefer to discuss. So we have to do more than hearing. We have to make that decision that we're going to be with the person and do more than hearing, to actually listen to them, to actually be with them in that space. That is a very sacred space of listening, at least in many conversations that we have that are maybe more important. If it comes down to just somebody talking about what we need to get for groceries, well, it's important to listen, but that's not what we're talking about here. Have your listening skills there. Here we're talking about really being with somebody where they need that experience of being listened to. The second question is an extension of the first. Will I listen to this person in this place at this moment? It's kind of getting your assenting internally to being open to that experience. So while the first one, again, the question that we just looked at was, will I do more than merely hear? Will I actually listen? Are you open to that with this person in this place at this moment? Now, why this is brought up is because not all of our listening experiences are going to be pleasant, wonderful, delicious sorts of opportunities to be with another. We might have to listen to somebody who is angry and upset at us, right? This happens on occasion where somebody has really taken issue with something that we've done. And we have to be willing to be with them in that moment, that person, in their rawness and their pain and their anger, and be able to hear what they have to say and listen to it from our hearts so that we don't immediately go to places of judgment, immediately go to places of shutting the door, immediately go to places of perhaps even retaliating, reacting quite negatively to what they're saying. The place, as I said, we should make sure that we have as much as possible set up a place that is safe for our interchange with that other person. We don't always have control over that, right? So again, the place might be challenging. We might need to say, okay, I'm willing to do this at this noisy cafe on the street, or whatever it might be, that I'm going to put aside whatever irritation I might find to be able to be with that person and listen to what they have to say. So I think this is an important part of our investigation as we're going about trying to be focused on that person. Otherwise, we won't have thought about, well, what is it like? What am I going into and being with this person and whatever emotion or moods they might have in this place at this very moment? Again, having already looked at my own stuff and hopefully set aside the things that are preoccupying me, worrying me. The third intention regards your purpose. Will I listen with the other person's needs foremost in mind? course, this is what makes this really healing listening, skillful listening, is the fact that we can actually put the other person first. As we see, that goes entirely against the grain of that obstacle of our self-centeredness that is oftentimes destroying our good communication with others, our listening to others. If we're willing to say, I am here for the other person 100%, which of course means also that we are not the main talker when we are in that situation of being the listener. In fact, the person who is listening should probably talk only a minimal amount of the time. And as we're going to see, we're going to look at some of the other skills around listening. It may mean occasionally giving verbal feedback, assuring that we're sort of on the same track as that person. But it doesn't mean, again, throwing all sorts of things out as they're talking about, oh, you can fix that by doing this, or you can do this, or have you thought about that? It means really just being there to listen and to really hear what the other person says. So again, this is a going against the grain of our normal self-centeredness. Listening is not about you, though you obviously, as I said, can gain a lot by that experience, by being with others. The other person is going to say the bulk of the words and kind of give uh, uh, what they need to say as the main part of that interchange. Okay. So let's go on then to the third factor that I think contributes to skillful listening, demonstrating genuine empathy and concern. So again, we've talked about empathy. Empathy, I actually did a little workshop on empathy through the FDCW when I was at Tupten Kungaling last time. Empathy is obviously something that we do have to some degree innately. Each of us having some sort of empathy. It might be limited in terms of the beings that we're empathic with, that we actually feel that sort of connection with. But it can be developed. It's a skill. And I might talk a little bit here. I'll throw it in. This is one of the main topics that's dealt with in this workshop that I did at Tupten Kungaling the last time, which is called balanced empathy, which is where we understand that there are two components to empathy. And one of them is more the kind of heart side of it, and the other I call more the head side of it. And so we have what's called the affective, AFFECTIVE, affective listening, I'm sorry, empathy, effective empathy, which is where we are with them in terms of feeling and emotion. It is important to have that kind of warm feeling from the other person that they actually are with you as you're saying what you need to say. But that, if it goes overboard, becomes drowning in what's going on. It becomes too much because we start taking on more of their suffering and we don't have that distance that allows us to understand that that still is their situation and we are in a different place. That's where we need the cognitive empathy that is cooler, that is more head-based, that is actually looking at it and saying, yes, this is the person's situation and their suffering. I feel for them. I have that affective empathy, but I also have a cognitive component that recognizes that what might be needed most is for me to be the cool head here, for me to be the person who's quite rational and looking at things and perhaps helping that person to deal with their emotions in that way. So it's kind of a balancing act. You have like a seesaw that goes from one side to the other. We want to find a way, and sometimes even it becomes more effective at times because that's what's required, especially initially when we're communicating with somebody and hearing what they need to say. And then it becomes more cognitive as the conversation goes on, but it's often balancing between the two so that we keep our hearts open and have that genuine concern, but we also don't sit there and just like drown in tears with the person when they're expressing their sorrow, for example. It is good to feel their sorrow, to actually have that dimension to the experience. But if we drown in it, then we're in the same sort of mire that they're involved in, and we need to have a different um, kind of vantage point to be able to genuinely help them, to be with them. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that, but we need to have that as a part of our being with others. It's not just sitting there and just sort of, listening to what the other person's saying without any sort of emotional component. The empathy is important. The last one, offering encouragement and interest. Remember how we said these were lacking, and when we started getting to the higher points within the deficient, but still not quite there in terms of being responsive, we have to be encouraging of the other person. Really be interested in what they say. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. By drawing close and yet keeping distance. This comes from James Miller's book. He talks about this idea of drawing close, which can be physically close. That's where, again, so much of the communication we have now that is distant is problematic because we can't be with the other person physically, but it doesn't mean getting too close, obviously. Some people are uncomfortable with closeness, and we have to be kind of respectful of that. But it's also metaphoric. We want to draw close in terms of how we are with them. This means giving, good eye contact with them, trying to be attentive to what they are saying. Doesn't mean staring at them all the time. Nobody's comfortable with that, right? If you brought somebody in to talk to them and you just stared at them the whole time, I mean, they'd freak out. Like, what are you staring at? Leave me alone. So it means having eye contact a good portion of the time, making sure that we show that closeness through body language, through not folding our arms like, okay, why are you here? But rather having the body open, actually, whoops, don't hit my bowl here. Having the body open and being, sort of that welcoming presence that we have for others. So that's what drawing close is all about, is creating a welcome space for them to feel comfortable being as close as they feel they need to us. But keeping a distance is sort of like that cognitive empathy side, right? We need to still have a distance in that this isn't like I'm going to sit on the couch with you and have my arm around you and just cry with you. That might be necessary at times in a very limited way, but it's not what you want to spend the whole communication doing, because it's just not necessarily going to be the most helpful. You have to find a way to keep some distance, to recognize that when the other person feels like they're drowning, then you want to be solid earth. If the other person feels like they're overwhelmed, then you want to be calm, cool, and collected, because that's what will probably they'll most benefit from. Doesn't mean you shut off the empathy side of it, and that drawing them close and feeling very welcoming. It means you find the balance there and make sure that you're responsive to what they need. So again, these are, I think, some of the skills that are demonstrated by what we looked at in terms of those three that were in the category of being more sufficient and even very nutritious ways of that we can interact with others. Let's take a look at some of the additional practices that support skillful listening. I've got a number of things I've assembled for this. Of course, meditation. Without a doubt, again, as I said, in any contemplative tradition, meditation is a key part of our practice. Now, what does meditation look like in terms of what specific meditations would be useful for your listening and for your ability to be with others? Obviously, some level of mindfulness is going to be involved in our meditation. Simply doing that is increasing our mindful awareness. But as I said, we also have to make a determination when we get up off the cushion to continue our practice of mindful awareness. I don't know how many of you have actually done, even though it's not part of our tradition, I am frequently encouraging people to do a Vipassana retreat, even a short Vipassana retreat. Some of them that are like 10 days or more can be a little challenging for some people because they're fairly rigorous. But what you do in engaging in that type of a retreat is that you really do fine tune your skill at mindful awareness. It's often done in combinations of both sitting and walking meditation, both done with the aim of increasing your mindful awareness of what you are doing and being present with what's happening, which again is what we're trying to do off the cushion, not in a kind of, as I said, unconditional way. Oh, I'm watching my mind get angry. Oh, I'm watching, myself pick up a knife to threaten somebody. That's not what we're doing in mindful awareness during our day. We're trying to be aware of how we want to be with others, the skills that we want to bring into our relationships and into whatever it is that we do. As we've been talking on Thursday night with the mind training practices, they're not effective unless we have a mindful awareness of them, unless we actually are able to bring them into our daily life. So meditation where we're focusing on that type of practice, mindful awareness, is an important component of it, just that alone. But I would also encourage you to certainly meditate on some of the other heart qualities that help you to be more open to others in a receiving way when you're listening to them. Having compassion for others, having loving kindness for others, and so on. One of my cats is here wanting attention. Let me see if she'll come up on my lap. Sometimes she does, but anyway, she's not going to today, I don't think. That's probably a good thing. Um, so just know that, again, meditation also can involve kind of developing those sorts of heart qualities. So say you are having somebody in your life who you have a difficult time communicating with, and you know that you're going to be meeting with them sometime soon, maybe even later that day. Well, then in your meditative practice, imagine being in that situation with them and practice holding compassionate thoughts towards them. Practice having loving thoughts towards them, wanting them to be free from suffering, wanting them to have happiness. This is how we actually bring those qualities to life, is by actually working with situations and people that we know we're going to have to encounter. Sometimes we have surprise encounters, right, where somebody comes into our life and really disturbs our peace and what have you. It's good to have those skills then as well. But certainly if we know that we're going to have an interchange with somebody, why not spend some time focused on them and creating these qualities, in your meditation? Then you'll have something to draw from when you sit down with them and actually have that conversation. You'll be able to go, oh yeah, I'm holding thoughts of loving kindness and compassion for this person while I'm genuinely listening to them. You've created a nice kind of warm space that helps them to feel safe and contained within that environment. So meditation is kind of purely the skill component of it, in terms of mindfulness, concentration, focus, all these sorts of things that we talk about frequently in meditation. But it's also using meditation on some of these qualities that we need in order to feel more welcoming to others when we're listening to them. Second one, holding awareness of our own reactivity and other thought patterns. Of course, we have to be kind of on guard, watching our own minds while we're listening to somebody, because if we're not, then chances are we're going to let some of that creep into our being with others, right? We're going to find that suddenly we're thinking about, oh, this person, they really need some help or whatever, doing whatever. When we start putting value judgments on them, we start going to places that aren't very helpful. I want to share a little bit from, this is what I mentioned earlier, that from this book, The Wisdom of Listening. It's by a woman who's, I might be mispronouncing her last name, Margaret Truxaw, Truxaw. I don't know much about her, but she wrote a wonderful article in this, and I think she's a Buddhist practitioner. And she says, one part of learning to listen is to simply stop talking and focus your attention on the speaker. Another part is to take responsibility for the thoughts and feelings that arise reactively and hold them in silent awareness without judgment, while returning again and again to the intended focus of the speaker. It's much like meditation practice. I watch my monkey mind try to get control of the conversation. I breathe and I gently bring my awareness back to the focal point of the speaker. I notice when I stray from this intention, I come back again to the focus, and then I do it again and again. So most of us, again, have monkey minds just like that, right? In our meditation, we are paying attention to the breath, for example, and we see that we're on the breath, and then we see suddenly that the mind's, off making plans for the weekend or whatever, and then we go, oh, then we go back to the breath, and then we see the mind wanders away again to something else, and then we go back to the breath. It's kind of taking the same practice we're doing in meditation into our listening to somebody else, being mindful and aware of when the mind starts going in that direction of imposing some sort of judgment on the person, having some reactivity to what the person's saying, some personal stuff that's coming up, some self-centeredness that's surfacing, what have you. Then we see that that's happening and we go back to the person. We bring our awareness back to focus on the person who is talking, what they are saying, listening to them. So I really like that analogy, because I think it does show that, again, we have the opportunity to bring a sort of meditative environment into how we are with others and listening to them. But we have to have that ability to see when all the garbage is arising in our own minds, our own reactivity and so on, that we actually say, oh, there it is. And we set it aside and we go back to paying attention to the other person. All our own garbage is going to be there afterwards that we can deal with. If we want to talk to somebody else or our therapist about our reactivity to the person we were listening to and to what they said, go ahead and process it later. But right now, it's an obstacle to your listening. Third, cultivating empathic listening. Of course, this means that we really do have to enhance our empathy. Again, in that course on balanced empathy, we do learn some skills and abilities around that. But obviously, this has to do with heart qualities, again, being able to be in touch and listen from the heart. I want to share here a wonderful little passage that comes from Joan Halifax Roshi's book. This is, again, the book that Being with Dying, I think, that I shared a little bit from last week. When I listen to someone who is suffering, I do not listen with my ears. I am listening in my heart, she says. I feel as if the sound is entering into my chest and shaping my heart. This practice of listening is very profound and very subtle. From the Buddhist perspective, it's the practice of Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezig, the Buddha of compassion, the one who hears the cries of the world and responds. Through deep and devout listening, we can open up the heart and mind to experience fundamental non-duality, which is the idea, again, that really in the end, what differentiates me and you is simply the thought of self and other, that we need to have an understanding of the sort of embracing of the totality of all things. An empathy that can be in that space with that wisdom of understanding as well as the heart open with compassion and love is what we're really driving for. It's going to be informed, as I said, to what degree we have opened our hearts previously with these sorts of meditations I mentioned earlier. Meditating on loving kindness, compassion, bodhicitta, our desire to benefit others. Then when we're with others, the empathy is almost guaranteed. We're going to be with them. Again, we might need some fine tuning of our empathy to make sure that it doesn't go out of balance, as I said earlier. But cultivating this is part of developing a more responsive way to be with others. Empathic listening. Again, we could call it healing listening. We could call it many different things. James Miller, in his book, he calls it healing listening, listening in a healing way. And that's how we want to be with others, is so that our act of listening to them actually becomes healing for them. But we're not going to have it without some empathy and some genuine concern for the other person. Let's go on to the next point, utilizing basic active listening skills. Perhaps you've heard many of these sorts of things shared before, but I think it's worthwhile to go through the list and to talk a little bit about those. There are different lists of sort of active listening skills, but I want to go through one list that I found on the internet. And this is real, again, not Buddhist in any way, but there's a lot of Buddhism behind a lot of these, and we can bring a Buddhist flavor to this. The first one, of course, pay attention. Give the speaker your undivided attention. Acknowledge what they're saying. Recognize that there's also things that perhaps aren't being said. We might even watch body language. Pay attention to what the person is doing. Are they getting uncomfortable in how they're sitting or what have you? That might indicate that they're getting close to touching on something that perhaps is a bit more difficult for them. We have to pay attention to the whole person. Again, look at them more directly, not constantly, but at least engaging, the eye contact towards them for a good share of the time. Put aside any of our distracting thoughts. Try not to be totally about, oh, I want to fix them and I want to give them this advice or whatever. Just pay attention. So again, that's the first one. Secondly, show that you are listening. When we're with another, they pick up on our body language as well. We're in tune with theirs by paying attention to what's happening for them, but they're picking up on our body language all the time, right? As I said, if we're sitting there with kind of our hands crossed and sort of leaning back and, sort of looking at them from a distance, that sends a particular message, right? Versus being wide open and sort of forward facing, engaging them. This has a very different experience for them. We might nod occasionally, show that we are hearing them. Occasionally, we might even, make small verbal comments that encourage the other person, like saying, oh, is that so? Or, yes, yes, can you tell me more or whatever? I mean, doing things that show, again, that we're encouraging them to be as open and honest as they need to be with us. Sometimes we might smile or use other facial expressions, but it depends upon what's being said. I mean, don't smile inappropriately. Somebody just shared something, bared their heart to you, and then, you smile at it. Well, then they're going to read that very differently. So we have to note our own posture, note the way that we are with others. Again, the third of these, I won't go back to the screen right now, is provide feedback. And this is something where you don't just simply encourage them verbally to kind of keep talking. You actually stop the conversation for a moment, especially if it's a comfortable time for stopping it, and reiterate what the person has said in your own words so that you are assuring them that they've been understood. That, it's not just them going off and saying stuff and you're just kind of sitting there and not really even, digesting what they're saying. So you might reflect what has been said by paraphrasing, what I'm hearing you say is, or it sounds like you are saying, and you could also ask questions to clarify. I mean, there may be times when people aren't being that clear in what they're saying. Maybe they're not even clear in all of their feelings and how to express them. And you can say to them, what do you mean when you said blah, 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 blah? Is this what you mean? You might even offer from your side what it is that you think that they mean. And I've had conversations like that with some people where it's really important that you do that questioning. Our role as a good listener often is to simply ask questions. Is this what you were saying? Is this, to get clarity, and once more, to validate them and assure that we're understanding them. We might even summarize what they say occasionally. That's another way of providing feedback, and say, oh, so what I've heard you say so far is the three things that you've heard. And then maybe they go, well, no, I also wanted to say, I may not have heard it right, but whatever. And they go on to kind of correct you. And that's fine. This is a way that we engage in that practice of providing feedback, restating, clarifying, summarizing. Number 4, defer judgment. As I said, judgment is one of the main things that gets in the way. Allow the speaker to simply finish what they have to say. Don't interrupt them with counter arguments. And again, certainly not saying things like, oh, we shouldn't feel that way, or, oh, I'm sure that's not what they meant. If that's what the person is feeling, let them express their feeling. Whether or not they're interpreting what other people said correctly, that's not the issue at this point. It's to defer that judgment. It becomes interrupting them becomes a waste of time, and it really frustrates people, right? Think about from your side when others have interrupted and said things when you were trying to genuinely share your heart. It's very frustrating. The 5th one, responding appropriately. Again, knowing that active listening already is its own response. As we saw earlier, that's sometimes the best way to help another is by simply being with them. I often find myself, not necessarily adding anything unless the other person agrees to that. They've shared all this information, sort of done their dump on me, and all of that, I now have. I've got, okay, all this container of all of what they shared. I'm not sure what they want from me at that point. And I might say something like, well, is there something that you'd like from me now? Is there some advice that you'd like to request, or or how are you feeling around what we've already done so far? But if we are going to give something in regard to our perspective on things, it's best to make sure the invitation is there for that. One of the things you might say at the end is to say, well, I have some thoughts based on what you said of a few things that might be of some assistance. Are you open to hearing that? That's very different than saying, oh, well, I know what you should do, right? Do this, 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 and this, and you'll be fine. Maybe doctors do that, right? Doctors may not have the best bedside manner, as they say, but what we want to do as a good listener is to really make sure that what we're offering is welcomed. And for some people, they may say, well, no, I feel much better now that I've talked to you about it, and I feel like I maybe want to sort through things myself. And you go, okay, well, that's great. Please let me know if you do need some further assistance. Yeah. They often say to treat the other person as they would want to be treated. We don't necessarily know that, but that's why the questions are so important. Is this what you need right now? Do you need some further advice from me? What have you? But, if we have heard something that is troubling for us, I think we need to be careful again around what our own what value our own perspectives are going to add to that. Our own opinions or our own whatever. Maybe again, that's something we do with someone else who can listen to us. When we're with that person who feels they need to be listened, make sure that our responses are appropriate for them. So again, certainly don't attack other people for what they've shared. Don't, we had that slogan in the other night about, don't talk about injured limbs. Don't like be pointing out the person's faults and kind of gladly poking them all over the place. So do you realize that you did that when you talked to them then? And do you realize that it was your fault? I mean, that's not really helpful. So active listening is a skill again. All of these things we're talking about require practice. So I just thought I would share a little bit of that as well. I have just a couple more things. This is a wonderful analogy that I got from a book that's called The 5 Keys to Mindful Communication. It's about the interchange of what happens with communication, not just speaking, but of course the listening side of it. And they use the analogy of a traffic light. And I find this really quite helpful too. Again, any of these things contribute, but sometimes you might find, well, this might be useful for the way that I'm, because of my conversations with certain people and the way they've gone, I want to have more mindfulness of this analogy. So we have a traffic light, right, that has 3 different colors. The red light is, of course, the more defensive, components of it. It's when we actually have things stopping, our defensive reactions come into play, and the traffic isn't moving anymore. The conversation has come to a grinding halt. Yellow lights occur frequently, though, when we're talking with others, right? It's sort of the crisis of uncertainty where things are in that middle zone and where we're not really sure. It might be going south, but we're not really quite sure yet. Green light is where we always want to be all the time, right? Ideally, it's where things are things are open, where they're flowing. Uh, the conversation is going well. We're feeling that connection with others. I want to read a little bit about this from the book by Susan Gillis Chapman. She says, listening is like pouring tea into a cup. And when the cup is clean and empty, we're able to hear what the other person is saying clearly. This is green light listening. But when the conditions aren't in place, we can't listen and the light is red. So again, all those factors that I talked about earlier that are part of unskillful listening might be polluting your cup so that you're not able to receive anymore. We even use this analogy in Buddhism, right? When we talk about being receptive to the teachings, we say that an ideal cup, first of all, is turned right side up rather than the other way down because nothing gets in. That's definitely red light, communication right there. If we're just simply have closed our mind to the other person, we're not hearing a word they say. They used to have that thing when I was many years ago, talk to the hand, right? Just talk to the hand. You're not even going to talk to me anymore. Just talk to my hand. So that's not a way to listen to others, obviously. The second way that our cup has to be is turn it upright, but then make sure that it's not polluted and that it's not having dirty and have other stuff in it, which is again all of our reactivity, our own stuff, our self-centeredness, everything that we bring into it that makes us hear things, listen to things through the lens of all of that. So it only becomes about us. Oh, the person sharing all this, but all I can think about is how it applies to me and my own situation and my own, whatever. That's not why we're there to listen to another. And we have to clean out the cup. But then the last one, of course, is to make sure that the cup doesn't have a hole in it, because if it has a hole or a crack, well, then everything that is coming in is not being held with attention and focus. Instead, it's just draining out, our phrase of one in one ear, out the other. Right. So again, this is what red light listening or communication would look like, is when some of those factors that we just discussed make the cup incapable of actually being a receptacle for what we are hearing from others and listening to them genuinely. And of course, responding accordingly, because our responses are not going to be on target either. And then going on, she says, like the secondary emotions of the red light, the energy of yellow light emotions is mixed up with confused ideas. Unlike the red light emotions, these ideas are not scripted into complete storylines. So we haven't gotten to the point where we've actually, turned the cup upside down through being really close to that person, not being willing to listen to them or whatever, due to distractedness, due to our own anger, whatever, or any of the other situations we talked about. So they're not complete storylines yet, she says. They remain fragments of self-doubt that we try to ignore. Instead of responding to the present moment, these fragments of fear and doubt contribute to a background sense of being cut off from ourselves. Kind of we get into that, I don't know, kind of middle land with the yellow light where things start creeping in. Fears or again, doubt is the word used here because we aren't sure where it's going. Where is the conversation moving? Is it going to go back into green after having moved into this yellow zone, or is it moving towards red? I find this actually a really helpful analogy to look at communications with others. Let me go back to the screen, as I want to just point out kind of the way that these are can be seen in terms of the main things that are happening. When we're in the defensive reactions of the red light, it tends to be me first mentality. Right, because we're only thinking about me, my emotions, and what you're doing, and how it's hurting me, or the reactivity I'm having, the things I need to be getting to, the busyness that I have in my life, and you're only bothering me by wanting to talk to me, what have you. Yellow light, again, that crisis of uncertainty, it's mostly doubt, or maybe again a little bit of fear, because we're not sure where things are going to go. See a yellow light, you don't know, is it going from yellow to red, or is it, well, actually they don't go from green to yellow to red anymore. They used to, I think. But in our conversations, they go all through these, right? They go from green to yellow to red, and actually it does go that way. It doesn't go from red to yellow to green, sorry. Anyway, green light, is we first, right? We know when we're in the green light space because it feels really good. It's we first. It's all of us together. We're having a wonderful open communication, you and I, whoever's involved. Okay. So the last thing I want to share today is from a Buddhist perspective as well. Another way that you can sort of impose upon your listening to another, the six perfections. Most of you are familiar with the six perfections. I don't have time to go into them in great detail, but we know that these are the practices in the Mahayana tradition, the practices of a bodhisattva. So I'm just setting out kind of very brief points about how we can work with them in the context of a communication we have with another. First, generosity. Giving our caring attention and concern to the other person. That's an act of giving. It's actually would be considered kind of giving protection. We're helping the person feel safe and in a loving environment by giving that empathic connection and wanting to be with the other person, giving them our time, free of any other concerns. Secondly, morality, maintaining virtue in the three doors of our body, speech, and mind as we sit with the other person, so that as much as possible we keep thoughts of anger, upset, whatever arising in our mind, and certainly don't, do anything verbally that would be non-virtuous. Patience, keeping the mind undisturbed. We may hear things that upset us. Definitely in some communications, people will say things that anger us. They might be being critical of us. To what degree can we remain undisturbed while we are hearing that criticism? Joyous effort is the fourth perfection. Staying enthused and interested. Again, we have to show the other person that we have that interest and encourage them by being there with them. It does take some effort to be in conversation with others, especially if you meet with others for some period of time, to be with them. I'm always amazed at therapists who meet, for an hour or so, 50 minutes, whatever, and they, the ones who are quite skillful have that sort of enthusiasm to be with you at that time. That's their job. That's what they are there for. Concentration, of course, focusing and staying present. We've talked about that quite a bit already. Wisdom has two elements to it. There's the conventional wisdom, knowing what is being called for at the moment. That means, once more, paying attention to signs and signals, being sure that we're not sharing things that are inappropriate in regard to our responding to what they've said and so on. But then there's the ultimate one, which again may not be the easiest thing to bring into our awareness when we're communicating with others, which is maintaining awareness of the emptiness of the three spheres. What is the emptiness of the three spheres? We have the ourselves as the listener, the act of listening that we're engaged in, and of course the object, the words of the person that we are listening to. And we can think that, again, they're lacking any inherent existence, which keeps them, it's ideally the meditation on emptiness, when we unite it, keeps it from having any sort of charge to it, because we see that, again, nothing has any sort of substantial inherent reality. It's all conventionally a play of things, a dependent arising. Again, that's a whole teaching in and of itself. I don't have time to get into that, but know that we can even bring the six perfections into how we listen. Okay, so today we've talked about a number of things. Again, we've gone through why we need this skill of good listening, being able to be with others in that way. What unskillful listening looks like. Remember the negative 1 through 5, these various units that were not sufficient, that we don't want to be giving others, we don't want to be feeding that to others, and we don't want to be receiving that from others. So best to change our behavior to skillful listening. We looked at everything involved in that, the main components and factors that help us to be with others, the empathy and so on that we need. And then finally, some other practices, some other ways that we can enhance our listening through our meditative skill, through framing things in regard to the three lights, the stop lights, the traffic lights, and then of course the six perfections and so on. So I want to thank you all for listening. Hopefully you've been listening today, not just hearing. I know it's a lot of information. I haven't checked with Patty and Nicole to see about, I'm happy to offer PDFs of the slides of everything I offered today, as well as the last two. And I'll send those along, and you can all decide how you might get those to people if they do want those, are interested in those. Because I know, especially today, it was a lot of information and lists and things. So any final questions from today? We have about, I don't know, 5-6 minutes left. Or comments from people. Again, if something resonated with you and you wanted to share something.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me okay?
I think you might not be able to hear you. The mic is.
You want me to
strong.
walk it up there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Who's speaking? Is it?
It's Mary Ann.
Oh, hi, Marianne. Good to see
Hey,
you.
how are
Good to
you?
hear you.
Yeah, this has been wonderful. I want to thank you so much. I can't wait to see you in September.
Oh, wonderful.
What do you do when, well, my sister has a friend that gets very emotional and they're talking on the phone constantly every day. And this one person's having a lot of physical problems, she gets totally excited and starts raging. And my sister just hangs up on her. What do you do with a person that gets so emotionally upset and they start raging in a way of communicating with you? Which is really a lot of her suffering, but what do you do with someone like that?
I think that's a really tough one, Marianne, because again, we don't want to sort of close the door at that point. I think hanging up is it's not it can be frustrating for you to have to listen to what's going on, but it can be equally frustrating, if not more so, for the other person to be completely invalidated at that point. I mean, I think it depends upon the person. To what degree is that person open to investigating the deeper causes of that rage, the deeper ways that they might be? Because, a good therapist, for example, and I think there's nothing wrong with therapy as a profession and us modeling our listening to others on the basis of how good therapists function, usually is asking questions to try to get the person to investigate deeper about what's going on. That was even mentioned as one of the skills we can have as good active listeners. So when somebody begins to rage, perhaps there's an opportunity to say, I can hear that you're really, this has gotten you really angry and upset. Can we maybe take a look at what's going on underneath the surface? If you have the ability to do that. Not everybody, again, has the ability to do it. Not everybody on the receiving end wants to hear those questions and do that investigation. But I think, again, I don't know your sister and this woman and all the situations and what's all involved, but so I think it can be very hard to make a sort of blank across the board sort of thing. The best thing to do is to see if there's a way to try to get at a deeper investigation of what's causing all of that rage, what is putting them into that place. And so it can be diffused to some degree, to be with them in a space of openness so that they can actually create some space around it. If you think about what happens with the mind as it moves into that, because you were talking, Marianne, about how the conversation gets more and more animated, it gets to a place where the mind becomes like, it starts off a bit open and it becomes tighter and tighter to where it's like almost this like very condensed thing that has hardly any room. The best thing to do at that point is to try to create more space. Try to create the opportunity for them to begin to question and investigate, and really, rather than continue to be in the emotion, which is not so helpful for them, though I know Western therapy has some differences in Buddhism with this. A lot of people use these sorts of expressive ways of working with emotions, such as anger. Um, some therapy involves that type of way of being. But for most people, it doesn't lead to anything real productive. It might exhaust them. They might get exhausted after raging for 5 minutes and then they eventually collapse. But that isn't any sort of real permanent relief. So again, if there's a space for some sort of investigation, but I don't know. I mean, again, not knowing the full situation, I don't know how open your sister's friend would be, how much your sister even feels like she could be with her and, provide that type of service or support. Um, I mean, maybe if it's comfortable to allow them to sort of rage on until they do get to that place of kind of exhaustion, and maybe just try to be with them in a space of breathing and trying to be back in a calmer state of mind, that might be useful. It really depends upon the person, but I don't know, maybe others have better suggestions than I do. I haven't really dealt with anybody who's been in that level of rage where I feel like, I have had the thought, certainly, yeah, some people just simply close the door, don't need to be with it. But to try to be with them in the space of that is challenging. And we don't always have the skills to do that, nor is the other person necessarily always open to that. Do you have anything more you want to share about, Marianne?
No, I'll pass that along.
Yeah.
Usually when she does try to talk to her friend, the
Mhm.
friend will, like what's going on deeper, it always ends up into, well, it's your fault, and the blaming that always comes in. So
Uh,
I don't know. But it's Yeah,
Yeah.
it is a difficult situation. Thank you so
I mean,
much.
another thing I might throw out that is a friend of mine actually had this experience when he would take his dog to the dog park. I don't know, I don't think his dog was really bothersome, but he would occasionally have people coming up to him based on what his dog was doing or whatever, and they'd be kind of in his face yelling, and he would simply ask the question, "What do you need from me right now?" And that might be a way of breaking the
I
energy
like
of that too, because it kind of like puts them into the space of going, oh, now I've got to be responsive to this question. And it takes them out of what they're feeling into what is it that you really need right now. And
that's
I don't know,
perfect. Thank you
that
so
one
much.
just kind of
I'll
popped into
remember
my head.
that.
So that
That's
might be
great.
a better one than what I just shared. But
Yes. Thank you so
oh, you're
much.
welcome, Marianne. It's good to see you in the Zoom room, and I'll see you in September. Any other questions or comments? Is that Anthony there? I think that's Anthony behind the
Yes,
mouse.
it is. Good to see you, Don.
Good to see you too. There was another question. Patty, did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Yeah, I did, Gen Don. Thank you so much for being here. It's a question on the last point that you made, and I think you said the emptiness of the three spheres. Is that correct? Did I hear that? Okay. And is that so? And you were saying that there's the speaker, the listener, and the words. So where my mind went was the gift, the giver, the gift, and the receiver. Is that kind of what we mean by the three spheres?
Yeah, though I think how I said it was actually the you as the listener, the listening, the act of listening, and the words that you're listening to, or the person who's saying them. So if we apply that same to giving, it would be you, the giver, the gift that you are giving, or the receiver, that can be the object, and then the giving itself. So they say the agent, the action, and the object. So it's also the action. I mean, it's weird. We don't think about action so much, as having kind of any sort of substantial reality, but we ourselves as the person, the agent, often we are imbuing with all kinds of levels of that. And certainly the other person or the object that, the words they're saying or the gift that we're giving, that's definitely something we adhere to in a solid way. But even the action itself is held to in some sort of solidity that isn't actually there. Okay, is that clear? So again, agent, action, object is how it's usually said. But like in some things with giving, we have kind of two objects. We have the object that is given, but we have the recipient who is the object we're giving to. So that's where it becomes a little different. But it's always those three. That's the three spheres. Sorry, I didn't make that clear when I said that. Any final questions or comments before we conclude? Okay, I'm back with you again one more Sunday, next Sunday. Let's do our dedication prayers to conclude today. Oh, yes, there was. Okay,
Sorry.
please. Sorry, I didn't see it. Please.
I guess sometimes the conversation will end up being either at loggerheads, just butting heads, or it will be a boring conversation. So my idea is, how do you end the conversation tactfully and politely, and leave the door open for another conversation in the future?
In the situation where it's boring?
It could be boring, or it could be a disagreement.
Right. Thanks, Steve, for that. Yeah, I think that the when it comes to concluding conversations, maybe that's like a whole nother course in and of itself, because I think there are challenges sometimes to that. Oftentimes we've allotted so much time for the conversation. Perhaps, we've said, oh, I've got an hour for you, or a half hour, or whatever it is. And so then there is some sort of natural end to it because we've reached the time limit. And I think sometimes that's a good idea. It's not to say that that's fixed in stone, so that if the person is in the midst of something and we need to keep meeting with them, then we have perhaps the opportunity to do that. But I think it's oftentimes, certainly with the first situation you mentioned, Steve, where it is really quite frustrating. The conversation has gotten to maybe loggerheads and we're really not, the energy is a little strange, is to really say, take charge of it and say, well, I'm glad that we had the opportunity to meet today, and I realize we have some things that aren't quite smoothed over and finished. Can we find another time to meet so that we can continue this, perhaps with different energy and some different, thoughts and what have you. That's perfectly a fine way to end things, to recognize that there's some need for some sort of follow-up, something that needs to happen afterwards, because it doesn't feel so complete when you're at that place of kind of heads bumping and then you just go, okay, well, time's up, let's leave or whatever. In terms, yeah, please.
A positive note?
Yeah, some sort of a positive note, or at least to kind of keeping the door open, rather than them feeling like, oh, well, then it's over, and whatever they shared. Now, there might be some situations, I'm not saying, because again, everything is situation specific. You might have some people who are continually complaining about something that you realize that it's more their issue than it is your issue, and your hearing them out might not really resolve the situation. And maybe that becomes a waste of time to just continually keep the door open for them to say the same thing again and again and again and again and again. So maybe there has to be some other skillful way of bringing that dynamic to a conclusion. But in terms of the conversations that are not so fruitful or boring, well, I don't know. I mean, well, we have to find tactful ways to work with that, so that, again, the other person doesn't feel like we're devaluing them. Maybe we're contributing to the boredom because we've got, nothing much to say or don't really find anything interesting. But hopefully, again, we can find a way that still gives them some validation, like you said, and on a positive note anyway. Well, I'm really glad we had the opportunity to sit down together and talk today. And, I'll look forward to talking again with you at some point, or some way of, again, allowing them to feel validated and understood. Not everybody is a dynamic speaker. One of my friends, I was kind of annoyed. He posted on Facebook this comment about, inviting people to your home to offer them a nice meal. Well, they have to bring some sort of, something to the conversation. Like, if you're going to invite people to your home, they have to kind of supply you with some sort of entertainment by who they are and what they bring. Not everybody's that way. I feel like I don't want that kind of pressure if I go to somebody, to be at their house, that I've got to entertain them for 2 hours or whatever. I think that's putting a lot on people. So know that not everybody is going to be incredibly interesting and have wonderful stories to tell and ways of being with you that are really enriching. And so we have to value them for what they are and recognize that that's who they are, and we can be that for them. We can mirror that back to them and give them a good feeling, even though it might not be so rewarding for ourselves. So I don't know. Does that help a little bit, Steve?
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate
Oh,
that.
good. Good to see you again online. I'll see you in September too. So
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
great. Okay, let's go ahead and conclude today then. So let me pull up the prayers. We're just going to do the 2 prayers that we have, that we generally do at the end of FPMT teachings. The first one we're dedicating for the enlightenment of ourselves and all beings, and then also making this aspiration that wish of bodhicitta, that desire that we be of great benefit to others, especially through our listening to the suffering of the world and responding accordingly, that wish may grow deeply in our own hearts and in the hearts of all beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then lastly, just also dedicate for the good health and long lives of all of our precious teachers, upon whom we all depend, and we want them to continue to be in this world to guide us and others. And then also we make dedications for those beings we're holding in our heart, whatever their suffering might be, that they may be free of it as soon as possible and experience true happiness and peace. And may this be so for all beings as well. Wonderful. Thank you all for your attention and for, as I said, listening today. I hope that what I've given provides you with some skills and some thoughts to digest around this. And again, it looks like there's a message from Patty in there. If you do want slides, send to spc@tuptenkungaling.org and she'll send them on. I'll send them on to her later today for today and the last 2 sessions as well. So, all right, everyone, be well. Have a very safe, happy week, and I'll see you on Sunday, if not on Thursday, some of you. Okay, be well now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Dave,